Look around at the people whose roots trace back to the Americas before 1492, before a single European ship ever touched these shores. Deserts of the Southwest, rainforest floor of the Amazon, the frozen tip of South America, barely 100 miles from Antarctica. That's almost the entire range of climates on planet Earth, packed into two connected continents. So if the sun really is the ruthless sculptor of human skin color, and everywhere else on Earth it is, you'd expect wild extremes here too. Ivory pale in the north, coal dark at the equator. Basically a Norwegian and a Nigerian, but American. That's certainly what happened everywhere else humans spread out. Northern Europe went pale. Central Africa stayed deep and dark. Same sun, same rules, same predictable result. Every single time. But that's not what happened here. Indigenous peoples from Alaska to Patagonia actually sit in a surprisingly narrow band of skin tone. Medium brown, give or take, the whole way down. Something broke the usual rules here. And the reason involves a frozen land bridge, the fastest migration in human history, mountains that mess with your DNA, and a 500-year collision that changed more about American skin color than the previous 15,000 years combined. By the time you finish this video, you'll understand why a Selknam elder standing nearly naked in near-freezing wind and an Inca noble living higher than most clouds ended up biologically closer to each other than either one is to their supposed European or African equivalents. Let's start at the beginning. Quick science. One time only, I promise, then we move. Skin color comes down to melanin. Melanin is your built-in sunscreen. More sun, you want more melanin, or UV radiation shreds your DNA and cancer risk climbs. But melanin has a price tag. That same UV your skin blocks is also the exact energy it needs to manufacture vitamin D, a molecule you cannot survive without. No vitamin D, no calcium absorption. Bones go soft. In kids, that's rickets. Bowed, bendy legs. In pregnant women, it's a softened pelvis, and childbirth turns dangerous fast. Flip it around. Too little melanin, too much sun, and UV starts destroying something else, folate. A molecule a growing baby needs to build its brain and spine. So every human population on Earth has been stuck balancing on the same knife's edge for tens of thousands of years. Enough melanin to protect DNA and folate. Not so much it starves you of vitamin D, that's the whole game. And how long a population has been playing it at a specific latitude, altitude, and diet decides exactly where they land. Keep that in your back pocket. We're not opening this textbook again. We're going hunting for its fingerprints instead. But before any of that hunting starts in the Americas, that same knife's edge had already been doing its work for tens of thousands of years, on a completely different continent. Every human being alive traces back to populations in Africa, living for a very long time under about as much direct sun as this planet delivers. Deep, rich melanin wasn't a fashion choice. It was survival gear, tuned by the sun itself over an enormous stretch of time. Then, tens of thousands of years ago, some of those populations started walking out of Africa into the Middle East, then fanning out across the vast Eurasian landmass, the biggest single stretch of connected territory on the planet. And Eurasia is where the knife's edge really started tilting in different directions, because Eurasia itself isn't one climate. It's dozens. Head northwest, into Europe, and the sun gets weaker, the skies get grayer, and generation after generation, natural selection quietly nudges skin lighter. More vitamin D squeezed out of less available light. Head east instead, into the vast plains and river valleys of Asia, and a different mix of sunlight, diet, and genetics produces its own separate lightening trend. Not identical to Europe's, running on a partly different genetic dial, but landing in a broadly similar range. Two regions, two different genetic paths, converging on a similar answer because they were both solving the exact same equation, just with different local numbers plugged in. Meanwhile, one group kept pushing, further north, further east, into Siberia, brutal winters, short, thin daylight, but also thick fur clothing, oily fish, and fatty meat from the animals that could survive out there. That diet mattered. When your food is already loaded with vitamin D, your skin doesn't need to lighten nearly as aggressively to get enough. So Siberian populations settled into their own moderate in-between tone, not pale like the far north of Europe, not dark like the equator. A calibrated middle ground tuned by thousands of years in a harsh, fatty diet, low-sun world. That middle ground population kept drifting east, generation after generation, following herds of mammoth and bison toward the very edge of the continent. And out past the edge of Siberia, something strange was happening to the map itself. The ocean was pulling back. Ice ages lock enormous amounts of the planet's water into glaciers, and sea levels drop, low enough that the seafloor between Siberia and Alaska rises up out of the water. Dry land, where there used to be open ocean. By the time those Siberian-tuned wanderers reached that new coastline, they weren't looking at a beach. They were looking at the edge of an entirely new, unclaimed piece of the world. What they carried with them onto that land bridge, genetically, biologically, is about to matter more than almost anything else in this story. And that exposed stretch of land had a name, Beringia, a vast frozen world connecting Siberia to Alaska. Not a narrow crossing, either. At its widest, Beringia stretched close to 1,000 miles north to south. Less a bridge, more its own frozen subcontinent, with its own tundra and its own animals. Some evidence suggests people were already walking across it over 20,000 years ago. The proof isn't a legend. It's actual fossilized human footprints, preserved in ancient lakebed mud in what's now New Mexico. And once people started moving south of the ice, they didn't really stop. Best current estimate, Alaska to the southern tip of Chile in something like 1,000 to 2,000 years. Stretch a map of the Americas out, and that's roughly 9,000 miles of coastline, mountain, desert, and jungle. Covered on foot in less time than separates us today from the Roman Empire. That might be the fastest continental migration in human history. For comparison, it took Europeans tens of thousands of years just to go pale. No maps, no compass, no recalculating GPS voice yelling at them from a satellite that doesn't exist yet. Just find food, follow the coastline, keep walking. Which means the people crossing 2 entire continents were still wearing their old Siberian skin tone the whole way. Moderate, medium, not extreme in either direction. They didn't have time to fully adapt. They only had time to survive. Their environment changed far faster than evolution could keep up. That single fact, moving faster than evolution could keep up, is the seed of almost everything you're about to see. Every twist from here on is just evolution finally catching its breath, region by region. And there's real debate here too, worth mentioning honestly. Some researchers think a first wave hugged the Pacific coastline in small boats, island hopping and fishing their way south, years before any interior ice-free corridor even opened up. Others still favor the classic walking route straight through the middle of the continent. Either way, the punchline doesn't change. Coastline or interior, boat or on foot, the clock started at basically the same moment, and the whole hemisphere filled up at a speed nothing else in human history quite matches. Before the pyramid builders, before the empire builders, before any of the names you already know, the very first Americans weren't civilizations at all, just small mobile bands chasing mammoths and giant ground sloths across a continent no human had ever set foot on. Archaeologists call one of these early tool-making traditions the Clovis culture, named after a town in New Mexico where their signature spear points turned up, about 13,000 years old. No cities, no writing, just tiny kin groups, spread impossibly thin across 2 entire continents, improvising survival in real time. Population density this low meant something else too. Almost no crowd immunity, no stored grain, no backup plan. One bad winter could wipe out an entire band. And yet within a few thousand years, their descendants were living successfully in literally every environment the hemisphere had to offer. And this is the population, this thin, scattered scrum of pioneers that carried the moderate, Siberian-tuned skin tone we just talked about into every corner of the hemisphere. Every civilization that came later just inherited it and lightly remixed it. Think about what that actually means genetically. Every Maya astronomer, every Inca road builder, every Mississippian mound engineer you're about to hear about, all trace back to the same tiny founding population walking behind a mammoth a few hundred generations earlier. Empires didn't arrive with new colonists. They grew locally out of the same original gene pool. But that same genetic starting point was now living under completely different skies. Down at the equator, the Amazon basin and the desert coast of Peru, home to the ancestors of coastal cultures like the Moche and later the Nazca. Same latitude, wildly different landscapes. The Moche built pyramid temples out of tens of millions of mud bricks near the coast. The Nazca, further south, carved enormous line drawings into the desert floor so huge you can only really see them from the air. Near constant brutal UV, basically equatorial Africa's evil twin, bouncing off jungle canopy in one spot, off bare desert sand in the other. You already know exactly what that does by now. Dark skin, thriving, next stop. One extra wrinkle worth a beat. The Amazon's canopy is so dense that direct sunlight barely reaches the forest floor in some stretches. So even within this one region, skin tone shifts a little depending on whether your ancestors lived under thick cover or out along an open riverbank. Same rainforest, two very different sun budgets. Now climb. The Andes, home turf of the Inca and the civilizations before them. You'd assume higher up, colder, weaker sun, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. Less atmosphere up there to filter UV. Radiation jumps roughly 10% for every 1,000 meters you climb, so Andean peoples were pulling equator-strength sun exposure in freezing mountain air at altitudes where oxygen itself gets scarce. Worst of both biological worlds at the same time. Result, more melanin than their latitude alone would ever predict. Plus a completely separate superpower, insanely efficient oxygen processing, bigger lung capacity, and blood built to carry oxygen more efficiently for surviving air this thin. Modern footnote, this is basically why elite marathon runners today train at altitude camps. Same trick, just borrowed for 6 weeks instead of inherited over centuries. Mountains don't just wreck your legs, they rewrite your DNA. And the Inca built an entire empire on top of this hostile terrain anyway. Over 20,000 miles of road, connecting cities thousands of meters apart, with runners relaying messages across the whole network on foot, at altitudes that leave most modern hikers gasping just standing still. Back down to sea level. Mesoamerica, the Olmec first, then the Maya, then the Aztec. The Olmec left behind colossal carved stone heads along Mexico's Gulf Coast, some over 9 feet tall and weighing many tons. Still nobody's totally sure why, or exactly how they moved them without wheels or draft animals. Biologically, this region sits in the calm middle of the whole American spectrum. Steady tropical sun, steady moderate skin. Not much drama, but here's a twist that's got nothing to do with biology. To the Aztecs, lighter skin wasn't genetics. It was status. Pale skin meant you didn't spend all day working the fields. Sun exposure literally became a class marker, the same way a suntan flips meaning depending on which century and which country you're standing in. The Maya went even further, and skin tone wasn't even the main event. Crossed eyes and a flattened, sloped forehead were considered stunning. Parents strapped little wooden boards to babies' skulls on purpose in the first months of life while the bone was still soft to shape them that way permanently. They also dangled a small bead in front of newborns' eyes to intentionally encourage that crossed eye look. To us, unusual. To them, the height of beauty and a mark of noble birth. The biology handed them a moderate baseline. The culture built an entire beauty industry on top of it. Zoom out for a second because the Aztecs' floating city is actually a good place to notice something. Tenochtitlan, that lake city of causeways, canals, and floating farms, so stunning that the first Spanish soldiers who saw it compared it to a dream, was built by people who, biologically, looked more or less like their neighbors 2,000 miles away in every direction. An empire that engineered floating farms and a lake city out of nothing, and none of that ambition, none of that power, none of that status game with pale skin and fieldworker tans, changed the underlying biology very much at all. Keep that in your head. We're about to see the same pattern twice more. Head north into the temperate zones, Ancestral Puebloans, building whole cities straight into cliff faces in the high desert southwest, multi-story stone apartment complexes, centuries before anything comparable existed in Europe. And the Mississippians, raising earthen mounds the size of city blocks, including Cahokia, a city that may have briefly outpopulated London, with a central mound that still ranks among the largest earthworks ever built in the pre-industrial world. A city you've probably never heard of, once bigger than one you definitely have. Let that sit for a second. You'd expect skin here to keep lightening with latitude, same rule as Europe. And to some extent, it does. Indigenous groups in the far north do tend to run a shade lighter than those near the equator. But there's a loophole, and it's one of the cleverest parts of this whole story. Diet. Coastal groups along the Pacific Northwest were eating salmon, seal fat, whale blubber, fish oil dripping off everything. Some of the richest natural vitamin D sources on Earth. The exact same move certain European hunter-gatherers pulled off before farming ruined it for everyone by swapping fish for grain. If your dinner is already handing you vitamin D, your skin never gets the memo to lighten up. Diet quietly overrides geography. The same sunlight, the same latitude, but a completely different evolutionary answer just because of what's on the plate. Compare that to inland farming groups on the Great Plains, living almost entirely on corn, beans, and squash, the so-called Three Sisters, with almost none of that oily coastal diet. No dietary shortcut for them, so their skin tone tracks latitude much more closely, the normal pattern reasserting itself the moment the loophole disappears. Now go the opposite direction entirely, practically Antarctica, Tierra del Fuego, the very tip of South America. This is where the story stops being about melanin for a second and starts being about pure nerve. The Selknam people lived here, in near freezing wind, sleet coming in sideways off the strait. Basically naked. Charles Darwin himself sailed past on the Beagle and wrote about it in his journal, genuinely floored that people could stand comfortably on deck in weather that had his own crew shivering under blankets. European explorers, bundled in 5 coats each, assumed something was biologically broken about them. Turns out, thick body fat, whale, and seal grease rubbed straight onto bare skin, and a resting metabolism cranked so high it's basically an internal furnace, burning calories faster than almost any population ever measured. Not a clothing problem, a biology problem, solved without a single jacket. And skin tone here, practically identical to Mesoamerica, to the Andes, to the Great Plains, one of the coldest, harshest inhabited places on the planet, right next to one of the hottest and most humid, and the skin tone barely moves. So here's the actual question. Not, why did indigenous Americans have some skin tone or other? Obviously they did. The real question is, why didn't the Americas ever produce the kind of extremes you see everywhere else? No ivory pale population anywhere near the equivalent of Scandinavia. No population as deeply, densely dark as equatorial Central Africa. From the Arctic Circle to Antarctica's doorstep, everyone stayed clustered in the same moderate middle. Africa and Europe had that spread. So did Africa and East Asia. The Americas, with nearly the same range of latitude and climate as those regions combined, somehow didn't. And we already met every piece of the answer along the way. We just have to add them up. Factor 1. Everyone arrived carrying the same starting point. Every single founding population walked in with that calibrated, moderate Siberian skin tone, not the deep equatorial dark of Central Africa, not the ivory pale of the far north. The starting line itself was already narrow. Factor 2. The clock started late. Modern humans had been adapting to Africa, Europe, and Asia for tens of thousands of years longer than anyone had been adapting to the Americas. Less time on the clock means less distance the dial could possibly travel. Factor 3. They moved too fast to stay put. Remember that 9,000-mile sprint. Natural selection needs generations parked in one place, under one specific sun, to slowly push a population's skin tone in a direction. People who cross an entire hemisphere in a couple thousand years never really sat still long enough for that dial to move very far in any one spot. Factor 4. The gene pool itself was small and shared. A tiny founding population funneled through one narrow migration route simply doesn't carry the same raw genetic variety for extreme pigmentation that Africa, Europe, and Asia had built up over tens of thousands of years and multiple deep, separate populations. You can't select for extremes that were never really sitting in the deck to begin with. Factor 5. Diet, clothing, and shelter kept taking the pressure off. We already saw it twice. Pacific Northwest salmon and Arctic sea mammal fat quietly delivering vitamin D, so skin never had to lighten. Fur and grease and clever architecture, blunting the exact environmental pressures that, elsewhere, ground skin tone toward an extreme over thousands of years. Technology and diet kept interrupting the experiment before it could finish. Factor 6. And all of that adds up to the simplest factor of all, less total time for divergence, stacked on top of every other factor, not one cause. A pileup of them, all pointing the same direction, for the entire 15,000-year run, before anyone from anywhere else ever set foot here. So how do we know any of this, instead of just guessing off a climate map? Frozen mummies, mostly. High in the Andes, Inca sacrifices left on mountain summits got naturally freeze-preserved for 500 years. Skin, hair, DNA, still intact. Nature basically built its own filing cabinet, and a 10,000-year-old mummy found in a Nevada cave confirmed the direct genetic thread all the way back to Siberia. One drawer, one line, whole migration confirmed. One quick footnote, because it puts everything you just heard into sharp contrast. Walk down a street in Los Angeles, Rio de Janeiro, or Mexico City today, and you'll see something close to the entire human skin tone range on Earth, sometimes in the same family. That range didn't come from 15,000 years of evolution. It came from about 500 years of ships, chains, and forced migration. Europeans, an estimated 12 million or more enslaved Africans, and later immigrants from Asia and beyond, all landing on top of that original, narrow indigenous baseline. So, if that isolation had never been broken 500 years ago, do you think we'd see much more extreme differences in skin tone today? Or barely any change at all? Let me know in the comments.